Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing a simple palette challenge, which I like to do all the time when I am not feeling particularly inspired. So basically I just go online, I find a color palette that makes me feel inspired or interested, and I draw something based off the image that color palette gave me. And for this particular one, I didn't end up changing one of the colors just because I thought it was a little bit too similar in value to some of the others. So this color palette, as many of mine are, was from the Instagram account Snazzy Colors, and I will link them in the description down below. But this sort of rosy / vintage-ish looking palette really inspired me, as well as the fact that I was listening to Merry-Go-Round of Life, so very like quartet, strings heavy piano kind of music really inspired me to go for sort of like a Victorian era look. When I showed it to my mom, she actually said it looked more like a saloon madam vibe, but you know, whatever people interpret it as, I suppose. But that was definitely the look I was going for, as well as using those reds. Since there were 3 different shades, light, medium, and dark, I figured I could use those colors to really bring to life some roses. So that was the main goal, to have a very warm-looking character with rose motifs. I wanted her to be very beautiful, as to keep with the thought of, like, you know, roses are very beautiful, but I gave her a very stern, almost angry expression. And I gave her that impression because while roses are beautiful, they also have thorns. So I wanted to give her this very prickly, unapproachable exterior to complement her beauty. Drawing roses is incredibly difficult, so that's probably something that took the most time out of everything in this illustration, was figuring out how to actually draw roses. I have drawn them before, but every time I have to relearn like the structure and how to really make them work. So I am pretty happy with how these roses ended up turning out. Their line art is a little bit thinner than the rest of the illustration, but I think in coloring they tend to stand out. So I don't know if I would really make the line art thicker, because the thin line art really makes the petals seem delicate and light. So I think it worked out pretty well. I also put a lot of effort into the hair, really making it look detailed in the line art, because there isn't really a lot going on in this illustration. So the contrast between the detail in her hair and the relatively illustrative face, the smoothness, the lack of texture, I think was an excellent contrast. So I really enjoy that. As far as her clothing goes, I looked up Victorian gowns. I'm not a big history fashion buff, so I don't actually know how accurate this clothing is. I kind of just chose it because I liked the high collar. I thought it really added to the strictness, the, you know, a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? Like unapproachable, very straight and proper and, you know, very structured. So I had drawn this ear and then realized that it was completely structurally wrong, so I had to go in and refigure that out without making it too realistic, because I didn't want it to draw away from the face too much, because if I put too much detail into it, you know, it becomes something of a focal point in the drawing, especially because it's relatively centered. So I thought that green color in the color palette would look really good as a background, because the rest of the colors were red, and green and red are complementary colors. So having them next to each other, it should mesh well with just about every red in that color palette, because it's a little bit of a damp, desaturated, more, less bright green, definitely more dusty and stuff. So I thought it would look very good next to just about every color in the color palette, so having it as the background, connecting to all of that, also lets me separate the other red colors pretty well. I planned it out enough that none of the colors, none of the reds were brushed up against each other, so in that way I think that the way that this illustration was planned out was very successful. I often have trouble with that when I'm doing color palette challenges because I try to do them where I'm not adding any additional colors. I did fudge that a little bit here because I wanted, a more painterly background that had some texture in it. So I ended up using a few different shades of green, and I also brighten up the roses later on with a brighter shade of red. But other than that, all of the colors are from the palette. So in that way, I think I was relatively successful. Even the line art is the darkest red color. So trying to keep all of that cohesive within the color palette was a little bit of a challenge. Because the shading color on the hair was the same color as the roses, I thought that by doing a clipping mask and making the line art of the roses lighter, it might look interesting, and it also might look like the edges of the petals had a bit of a highlight going on. I don't end up liking it very much because when I shade the roses, that lighter color on the darker parts, it really doesn't work well. So that is another area where I stepped out of the color palette. I took that darkest color and made it just a couple shades darker, so that it could hold up against the shading, so the line art could still be seen through. And that's just because I had done so much work structurally on the petals that if I had made it the same color as the shading, you would have just sort of ended up with these blobs, which in my opinion didn't look the greatest. But it was a little difficult actually to shade the flowers, and I think part of that was because I used the lighter line art on the clipping mask. So no matter how I shaded it, it was still having these bright edges. So that is why I ended up going in and changing it, even though I do actually like the way the lighter line art looks. I also added some dark red lipstick to tie into the rest of the illustration. I thought it brought up a little bit of that dark color into her face where it was looking kind of monotonous. And I did an overlay layer on the roses to kind of give them a little bit of a glow because I really wanted them to stand out from her hair, from the background, from everything else. I was actually pretty happy with how the dress turned out. I think the shading on the sleeves actually does make them look fluffy. And I wanted to do an embroidered pattern kind of thing on the roses. So instead of taking the hours it would have taken me to do that myself, I just grabbed a rose texture online and did an overlay of that. So I actually think that turns out looking really good. I darkened one half of the illustration and lightened the other, so it looked like there was a bit of a shadow behind her, and also to draw the eye more towards her face. There I am adding in the rose texture. It did lighten up her dress a little bit because of the white background, but I actually don't mind that at all, and I think the overlaid roses look really good and add a little bit of texture and visual interest. And so here's the finished illustration. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, like. If you want to see more, subscribe. I will leave links to my social media in the description down below. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day and all that jazz.